Some stories about heartbreak in the Philippines start with a man being deceived. This one starts with a man doing the deceiving first, years before anyone deceived him back. And it only makes sense if you're willing to sit with that order, rather than skip ahead to the part where sympathy comes easier. This is the story of a marketing executive who built his whole career controlling other people's narratives, and what happened when the narrative he'd built around his own divorce came due. With interest, exactly 2 years later, delivered back to him in a voice that wasn't his own, but a vocabulary that unmistakably was. I need to start with what I did, not what was done to me, because otherwise this story is a lie, the same kind of comfortable, self-serving lie I told for 11 months before I ever acted on it. 28 years married to Susan. 2 kids, Danielle and Marcus, both grown, both out of the house by the time any of this happened. A decent home in Portland's Selwood neighborhood we'd bought when Danielle was still in diapers. A shared history that most people, looking at it from the outside, would have called a genuinely good marriage. I spent 34 years in marketing, the last 18 of them as a senior executive at a mid-sized agency handling regional accounts for outdoor apparel brands. The kind of job that trains you, whether you want it to or not, to think constantly in terms of narrative, positioning, controlling how a story gets told before someone else gets to tell it for you. Susan and I met in our mid-20s, at a mutual friend's wedding of all places. Both of us seated at the same overcrowded table near the back. Both of us equally unenthusiastic about the band's questionable playlist choices. Married at 29, after 4 years of a courtship neither of us ever described as anything but easy. Built a life together the way most couples do, one ordinary decision at a time. First apartments, first mortgages, the specific chaos of 2 small children arriving 18 months apart. Sleepless nights blurring together into a kind of exhausted, devoted haze neither of us fully remembers with much individual clarity anymore. And by the time I was in my late 50s, I want to be honest that the marriage had genuinely gone quiet in the way long marriages sometimes do. Less conflict than simple distance. 2 people who'd raised their children successfully and then discovered they weren't entirely sure what came next between just the 2 of them. I don't think that quiet was unusual. I don't think it was even particularly dangerous, on its own. Plenty of couples move through exactly that stretch and come out the other side of it still married, still fine, sometimes even closer for having weathered it, and I've since met several of them, men my own age who describe an identical stretch of quiet that simply resolved itself once the kids were fully launched and the 2 of them had time again to rediscover each other. Proof enough, if I ever needed it, that the ending I chose was never the only possible one. What I did with that quiet is the part of this story that actually matters. Because I didn't sit inside it and work on the marriage. I went looking for an exit, and then I built the entire justification for that exit afterward. The way you build a marketing case for a product you've already decided to launch. I met Regine at a conference hotel bar in Manila, on a business trip I'd extended by 3 days, for reasons I told myself were purely professional at the time, and have since had ample opportunity to reconsider, some minor pretext about following up with a regional distributor that could easily have been handled over email, had I actually wanted it handled over email. She was 31, worked in hospitality management at a mid-tier hotel chain, sharp, funny, entirely unbothered by the 29-year age gap, in a way that flattered me more than I want to admit, asking genuinely engaged questions about the outdoor apparel business that most people back home had long since stopped finding interesting after 2 decades of hearing about it at dinner parties, laughing at jokes I'd made 1,000 times before that had long since stopped landing with anyone who actually knew me. We talked for 4 hours that first night, well past the point any reasonable conference networking conversation should have lasted, and I remember flying home to Portland a few days later carrying something I hadn't carried in years, a specific, electric sense of being genuinely interesting to someone again, the particular high of a man who's spent a decade feeling invisible inside his own house, suddenly feeling seen, a feeling I chased far harder than I ever admitted to myself at the time. What followed was 11 months of video calls, most of them late at night after Susan had gone to bed, conducted with the same careful, compartmentalized discretion I'd have applied to any sensitive internal communication at the agency. phone on silent, laptop angled away from the bedroom door, headphones in, even when the volume barely required them, never quite lying outright to Susan, never quite telling her the truth either, occupying that specific gray territory that people who are good at controlling narratives are unfortunately also very good at inhabiting. I told myself, across those 11 months, a story that I now recognize, with real clarity, as the standard anesthetic every man in my position reaches for. The marriage had been dead for years. Susan and I were essentially just roommates at this point. She'd understand, eventually, once she saw how much happier I was. I believed every version of that story completely while I was telling it to myself. The way you believe your own pitch deck right up until a client asks a question you haven't prepared for. And I want to be honest that no client ever did ask me that question, because I never once gave Susan the chance to ask it before I'd already decided the answer on her behalf. I handled the divorce, when it finally came, exactly the way I'd handle a difficult product launch, and I want to describe that honestly rather than softening it, because I think the mechanics matter to understanding everything that happened afterward. I controlled the timing, choosing to have the conversation with Susan on a Tuesday evening, rather than a weekend, when the kids were less likely to be around, when there was a clean stretch of days before either of us had major obligations, the same instinct that had once told me never to announce a product recall on a Friday afternoon if you could possibly avoid it. I controlled the framing, presenting it to her, and later to Danielle and Marcus, as a mutual, if painful, recognition that we'd simply grown apart, rather than the truth, which was that I'd already built an entire alternative life on the other side of the world, and was now simply announcing it. A distinction Susan herself called out almost immediately, sitting across from me at our own kitchen table, with an expression I've thought about often since. Somewhere between disbelief and a kind of exhausted recognition, as though some part of her had already suspected this exact moment was coming, and simply hadn't wanted to be right about it. Her hands wrapped around a coffee mug she never once brought to her lips across the entire 40-minute conversation, the coffee going cold and untouched between us the whole time. I minimized the guilt, my own guilt specifically, treating it the way you'd treat a negative data point in a campaign report, acknowledged briefly, then filed away, never allowed to derail the larger strategic narrative I needed to maintain in order to keep moving forward, a discipline I'd spent 34 years cultivating for entirely different purposes and had apparently never once questioned whether it belonged anywhere near a marriage. I kept $410,000 as my share of the settlement, a fair division under Oregon law given the length of the marriage and our respective contributions, Susan keeping the house and a comparable portion of our retirement accounts. And I flew to Manila 11 weeks after the divorce was finalized, telling myself, in language I now recognize as almost embarrassingly on-brand for a man who'd spent his career writing taglines, that I was being reborn at 60. I remember actually using that phrase, reborn, out loud, to my old colleague Frank over drinks the week before I left, delivering it with the same practiced confidence I'd once used pitching a rebranding campaign to a nervous client. And Frank, a decent man who'd known Susan almost as long as I had, met at the same agency where we'd both cut our teeth decades earlier, just looked at me for a long moment and said, "Gerald, you're not being reborn. You're just moving the furniture to a different house and calling it a new life." I laughed it off at the time, waved him away with the kind of easy dismissiveness I'd perfected across 3 decades of client meetings, certain he simply didn't understand the genuine transformation I was about to undergo. I think about that sentence often now, turning it over the way you turn over an old photograph, finding new detail in it each time. Regine and I settled into a life together in Manila that felt, for the better part of 2 years, exactly like the vindication I'd been telling myself to expect. I rented a comfortable 2-bedroom condo in a decent part of the city, put down a substantial deposit that Regine and I discussed as though we were building something permanent together, picking out furniture over long, easy weekend afternoons, the kind of small domestic partnership I hadn't experienced with genuine excitement in years, and I found myself genuinely happy in ways that surprised me. Waking up next to a woman who seemed delighted by my company rather than merely accustomed to it, rediscovering a version of myself I'd assumed had quietly disappeared somewhere in my 40s. I want to be honest that this happiness was real, at least on my end, not manufactured, not a story I was telling myself the way I'd told myself the story about the dead marriage. Whatever else this account reveals about my own culpability, I don't think the 2 years themselves were a performance. I was generous with Regine across those 2 years, and I want to be specific about that generosity because it matters to the total figure I'll get to shortly. I covered her rent on a separate apartment she kept for her mother, roughly $400 a month, a request framed with real warmth about wanting her mother settled somewhere safer than the neighborhood she'd lived in for years. A small, modest building I visited myself on 2 occasions, meeting a genuinely warm, grateful older woman who seemed, by every appearance, sincerely moved by her daughter's good fortune. I funded a gym membership and a series of personal training sessions she'd taken up with real enthusiasm, an investment I encouraged wholeheartedly at the time, genuinely pleased to see her building a healthier routine, even joking with her once that I hoped some of that discipline might rub off on me, a joke she laughed at with what I remember, at the time, as complete sincerity. I paid for a small business venture, a nail salon her cousin wanted to open, roughly $18,000 in startup capital that I extended without much scrutiny, the same casual confidence I'd have applied to approving a modest marketing budget for a promising new account, waving away Regine's own careful, almost apologetic explanation of the numbers with a confidence that, in hindsight, was really just a habit of not looking too closely at figures I could comfortably afford. The same casual generosity that had once made me feel expansive and successful, sitting across a table nodding along to a spreadsheet I never actually asked to see in full. None of these individual expenditures struck me, at the time, as anything other than the ordinary generosity of a comfortable man supporting a partner he loved. Looking back at the full ledger now, they add up to something considerably larger than I ever tracked in real time, precisely because I never once sat down and audited the whole picture the way I'd have insisted any junior account manager do with a client's spend. The first small inconsistency I noticed came about 14 months in, an evening when Regine mentioned, in passing, a scheduling conflict at the gym that required her to take a private session at an unusual hour, 7 in the morning, well before her normal routine, a shift she explained casually as the only slot her regular trainer had available that week. I didn't think much of it at the time, the kind of detail that registers only faintly and gets filed away without examination, the way a marketing man learns to notice small anomalies in a campaign's performance data without necessarily acting on any single one of them, waiting instead for a pattern to declare itself clearly before committing any real attention to it. There were other small things across the following months. A phone she began keeping closer to herself than she had in the earlier stretch of our relationship, face down on the counter now, rather than left casually wherever she'd set it down. An increased frequency of gym sessions that seemed to have less and less to do with fitness goals she'd actually articulated to me at the start. A particular new lightness in her mood on the days she came home from those sessions that I told myself, generously, was simply the natural high of a healthy new habit. There was, too, a specific evening a few weeks before the end, when I asked, lightly, almost as a throwaway question, whether her trainer was any good, and she answered a beat too quickly, a beat too warmly, with a level of detail about his coaching style that struck me, even in the moment, as slightly more than the question had actually called for. I want to be honest that I noticed these things and chose, actively, not to examine them closely, and I recognize now that this choice wasn't naivety in the way I might once have described it. It was the same specific skill I'd used on myself throughout the 11 months of video calls with Regine, while I was still married to Susan, the practiced ability to look directly at an inconvenient pattern and decline to name it, because naming it would have required action I wasn't yet prepared to take. The exact same discipline that had once let me build an entire second life without ever once forcing myself to say the word affair out loud, even privately, even alone. The breaking point arrived on an entirely ordinary Thursday, a visa appointment I'd expected to run the full afternoon, that instead wrapped up in under an hour due to a cancellation elsewhere in the office's schedule, leaving me with an unexpected gap and no real plan for it beyond heading home earlier than usual. I remember the specific, small pleasure I felt walking up to our building that afternoon, anticipating a nice surprise for Regine, imagining her reaction when I arrived hours ahead of schedule, maybe suggesting we take advantage of the unexpected free afternoon to visit a restaurant we'd been meaning to try. What I found instead was 2 suitcases standing packed and zipped by the front door, Regine sitting on the edge of the bed with an expression that shifted, in the span of about 2 seconds, from startled to something far more composed, a transition I recognized immediately and uncomfortably as the exact same kind of rapid narrative recalibration I'd performed myself, countless times, in high-pressure client meetings, the visible moment of a professional mind quickly abandoning one script and reaching for a steadier one. I asked her, standing in that doorway with my briefcase still in hand, what was happening, my voice coming out steadier than I felt, some old professional reflex kicking in even in that moment, the same instinct that once let me deliver bad quarterly numbers to a room full of anxious clients without a visible tremor. She didn't deny anything, didn't scramble for an excuse, didn't perform the kind of flustered guilt I might have almost preferred to what actually came next. She simply told me, with a calm, measured clarity that felt disturbingly professional, that his name was Paolo, that he was 27, a trainer at her gym, the same private morning sessions I'd noticed and chosen not to examine, and that she'd been planning to tell me that same week, regardless of whether I'd come home early or not, that in fact she'd already rehearsed the conversation in her head several times, waiting for what she'd considered the right moment. And then came the part of this story that I've turned over more times than almost anything else in my 62 years on this earth, the part that made this experience something categorically different from an ordinary heartbreak. Regine explained her decision to me using, nearly word for word, my own language, the exact phrases I'd used on Susan in our own kitchen in Portland 2 years earlier, phrases I hadn't spoken aloud since and had certainly never repeated to Regine, phrases that existed, as far as I knew, only in a single conversation, locked away in a different country and a different marriage entirely. Gerald, I think we both know the relationship has run its course. I felt something cold move through my chest, hearing that specific sentence, the phrase, run its course, landing with an eerie, exact precision I couldn't have anticipated. The specific rhythm of it, matching a sentence I could still hear myself saying, standing at our own kitchen counter, Susan's hands frozen around a coffee mug she never actually drank from. I deserve to feel alive again, the way I used to. Alive, the precise word I'd used with Susan, standing in that same kind of doorway 2 years and 1 lifetime earlier, a word I remember choosing carefully at the time, because it had felt, to me, like the gentlest possible way to describe something genuinely brutal. I'll always care about you, Gerald. That's real. This isn't about hurting you. I stood there in that Manila condo, 62 years old, and heard my entire divorce announcement played back to me in a different woman's voice, aimed now at me instead of coming from me, and I understood, with a clarity that arrived far too late to do anything useful with, exactly what kind of story I'd actually been living inside for the past 2 years. I didn't say much in that moment. I want to be honest that some part of me, even standing in the wreckage of it, recognized the structural elegance of what was happening, the same cold, professional appreciation I might once have reserved for a competitor's unexpectedly brilliant campaign. Regine left within the hour, the suitcases already packed, Paolo apparently waiting somewhere nearby, and I sat alone in that condo for a long time afterward, not crying exactly, more stunned, running the whole thing back through my head the way you review a failed pitch, searching for the exact moment the strategy had actually gone wrong, only to realize, slowly, that the strategy hadn't gone wrong at all. It had simply completed its arc, the same arc I'd set in motion myself 2 years earlier, arriving now at its logical, symmetrical conclusion. There was one moment, about a month before the actual breaking point, that I've come to understand differently in hindsight than I did at the time. Another American expat I'd befriended in Manila, a retired airline pilot named Warren, who'd been living there for close to a decade, with a Filipina wife of his own, a marriage that by every appearance was steady and genuinely happy, the two of them regularly hosting small dinner gatherings that Regine and I had attended together more than once. Mentioned to me over drinks at a small bar we both frequented that his own wife had noticed Regine and her trainer looking close at a mutual acquaintance's birthday party a few weeks earlier. The word close, delivered with a careful, deliberate lightness that I understand now, was Warren's own attempt at controlling a narrative, softening a warning he suspected I wasn't ready to hear directly. I remember laughing it off at the time, telling him that Regine was simply a friendly, sociable person, and that reading anything more into it said more about small expat community gossip than about my relationship. Warren didn't push back. He just nodded, in the particular way of a man who's decided he's done what he can and isn't going to force the rest. I think about that conversation often now, how easily I dismissed a genuine kindness, because accepting it would have required me to entertain a possibility I'd already decided, somewhere beneath the surface, not to look at too closely, the same practiced blindness I'd once turned on my own marriage. The financial reckoning, once I finally sat down to calculate it properly a few weeks later, came to roughly $210,000, the condo deposit, most of which I understood I had little practical recourse to recover, given the terms under which I'd originally provided it, the accumulated generosity across 2 years, the mother's rent, the gym memberships and training sessions that had, I now understood with a bitter kind of clarity, directly funded the very relationship that ultimately ended mine. An irony I sat with longer than almost any other single detail of this whole experience. The nail salon capital that Regine's cousin, as far as I could later determine, had genuinely used for its stated purpose. One small mercy in an otherwise thoroughly demoralizing accounting. $210,000 against the $410,000 I'd arrived with meant I was leaving this chapter of my life with roughly half of what I'd started it with. A devaluation that felt, in a strange way, appropriate to the story, rather than simply painful, though it was certainly painful too. The kind of number that keeps a man awake doing arithmetic in the dark, long after any productive purpose to the calculation has passed. I called Frank about a week after Regine left, sitting in that half-empty condo I hadn't yet worked up the resolve to move out of, boxes half-packed around me, though I hadn't yet decided where any of it was actually going. The late afternoon light coming in through blinds I hadn't bothered opening properly in days, and told him the whole thing, start to finish, including the specific detail of the language, the exact phrases repeated back to me. Frank was quiet for a long moment on the line, long enough that I checked whether the call had dropped, and then he said, with a directness I appreciated more than I let on at the time, "Gerald, I'm not going to pretend I'm not sitting here thinking about that furniture comment I made before you left. But I'm not calling you to gloat. I'm calling because I think you actually need to sit with this one, rather than marketing your way out of it like you usually do." I told him he was right, on both counts, and I remember that call as the first moment I genuinely committed to trying to understand what had happened, rather than immediately constructing a new narrative to survive it. A commitment that has taken the better part of the following year to actually honor with anything approaching consistency. I want to explain something about why I can't call Regine a scammer, why that word, tempting as it would be to reach for, doesn't actually fit what happened here, at least not cleanly, and why using it would require me to convict myself of the exact same charge. Regine took my money, yes, over 2 years, in amounts that added up to something substantial, but she never once deceived me about the fundamental architecture of our relationship, the way, in hindsight, I understand I deceived Susan across those 11 months of video calls. Regine and I built something that was, as far as I can tell, genuinely mutual for a real stretch of time. 2 years of what felt, from the inside at least, like authentic connection, before it ran its course in exactly the way relationships sometimes do, ending not through calculated theft, but through the same ordinary human drift toward someone new that had once carried me straight out of my own marriage. I raised this exact question with Dr. Alvarez early on, sitting in her small, quiet office on a rainy Tuesday afternoon much like the ones that had once carried Susan and me through the hardest stretch of our own marriage, whether I was simply refusing to see Regine clearly out of some misplaced sense of fairness, and she pushed back on that framing directly, in a way I found useful even though it stung. Gerald, calling her a scammer would let you off the hook in a very particular way. It would make this a story about something that happened to you, rather than a story about a pattern you set in motion and then watched come back around, years later, in a country you'd chosen precisely because it felt far enough away from the consequences of the first version. I think you already know which story is actually true here. I sat with that observation for a long time afterward, recognizing, uncomfortably, how badly some part of me had wanted the simpler version, the version where I could finally, cleanly, be the wronged party in a story for once. I think, if I'm being rigorously honest with myself, that the real crime here, if crime is even the right word for it, wasn't financial at all. It was structural. I had spent my entire adult life understanding relationships as narratives to be managed, controlled, exited on my own terms, with the guilt minimized and the framing carefully constructed in my favor. What Regine did to me was simply demonstrate, with an almost surgical precision I don't think she fully intended as a lesson, that I'd never actually been the author of that narrative in the way I'd assumed. I'd simply been the first character to reach the exit. Someone else was always eventually going to reach it too, and there was no guarantee, none at all, that it would happen on my schedule rather than theirs. I flew back to Portland about 6 weeks after Regine left, not because I had a clear plan for what came next, but because I understood, somewhere in that stretch of long, quiet evenings alone in the condo, that whatever healing I needed wasn't going to happen in a city where every familiar street corner now carried some association with a relationship that had ended almost exactly the way I'd once ended my marriage. The same coffee shop where Regine and I had spent lazy Sunday mornings. The same stretch of waterfront where we'd once talked for hours about a future I now understood had never actually included me the way I'd assumed it did. I rented a small apartment near my old neighborhood, close enough to occasionally run into people I used to know, far enough from Susan's house that I never once had to worry about an accidental encounter neither of us was prepared for, a modest one-bedroom that felt, in its emptiness, oddly appropriate to where I actually was in my own life at that point. No furniture worth arguing over, no history embedded in the walls, just a clean, undecorated space I could slowly, carefully, fill with a version of myself I was still working out how to build. I called Danielle, my daughter, about 2 months after returning, and told her a version of the whole story, more of it than I'd initially planned to share, including the specific detail about the repeated language, because I understood, somewhere in the telling, that leaving that part out would have been its own kind of dishonesty, the exact same instinct toward narrative management I was supposedly trying to unlearn. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed in that small rented apartment while I told her, my voice unsteady in a way I hadn't expected it to be, having rehearsed a calmer version of the conversation beforehand that I abandoned almost the moment she picked up the phone, the careful script dissolving within the first 30 seconds of actually hearing her voice. Danielle was quiet for a long time on the phone, long enough that I began to wonder whether I'd said too much, and then she said something that landed harder than almost anything else in this entire experience. Dad, I'm not going to pretend I'm not still angry about what happened with Mom, but I think what you're describing right now might actually be the most honest thing you've said to me in 3 years. I didn't have a good response to that. I still don't, fully, though I've thought about it more than almost any other single sentence from this whole ordeal, turning it over on quiet evenings the way I once turned over campaign metrics that hadn't performed the way I'd projected. I've heard, through mutual friends who still occasionally pass along updates neither of us ever directly requests, that Susan is happy now, genuinely happy, involved with a retired teacher she met through a community gardening group, the kind of quiet, steady, unglamorous happiness that I don't think I ever once, across 28 years of marriage, managed to properly build with her myself. No dramatic gestures, no grand reinventions, just two people apparently content to spend ordinary Saturday mornings, pulling weeds together. I felt something complicated hearing that news. Not quite jealousy, not quite relief either. Something closer to a strange, humbling gratitude, that at least one person in this entire story got to walk away from my decisions and land somewhere genuinely good, even if I wasn't the one who got her there, and even though some part of me will probably always wonder whether she'd have found that same contentment inside our marriage if I'd ever actually done the work rather than simply leaving to find it elsewhere. I've spent a considerable amount of time in therapy since coming back to Portland, more time in the past year than I'd spent across the previous 6 decades combined, working through what a genuinely good therapist named Dr. Alvarez has helped me understand as a specific, recognizable pattern in how I approach relationships, treating them as campaigns to be run rather than partnerships to be genuinely inhabited, always keeping one eye on the exit, always prepared to control the story of my own departure well before I'd actually done the harder work of staying present inside the relationship itself, a pattern she traced back, gently but persistently, to a childhood where my own father had left without a word of explanation when I was 11, an old wound I'd spent decades believing I'd fully resolved simply by never once discussing it. I don't think that pattern excuses anything I did to Susan. I think, if anything, understanding it clearly has made the weight of what I did to her heavier rather than lighter, because I can no longer tell myself it happened, despite my best efforts, rather than because of a habit of mind I'd spent decades cultivating for entirely different professional purposes. A habit I'd never once thought to question because it had served me so well in every other room of my life, right up until the one room where it mattered most. Dr. Alvarez asked me once, several months into our work together, sitting in her small office with its careful, neutral furniture, whether I thought I'd have eventually done to Regine what I did to Susan, left first, controlled the narrative first, if things had simply continued longer, if Paolo had never entered the picture at all. I sat with that question for a long time before answering, watching a slow afternoon rain move across the window behind her, and the honest answer, once I finally arrived at it, unsettled me more than almost anything else we'd discussed. I think I probably would have, eventually, once the initial vindication wore thin, the way these things always seem to for me, once ordinary life crept back in, and I started, without quite noticing, scanning the horizon again for the next exit, the next fresh narrative to build myself around. That's not a comfortable thing to know about yourself at 62. It's also, I've come to believe, considerably more useful than the comfortable version I'd have preferred to keep believing instead, the version where Regine was simply the villain of a story that otherwise cast me as a man who'd finally found real happiness, rather than simply relocated the same pattern to a new country. I'm not asking anyone hearing this story to feel sorry for me, and I want to be genuinely clear about that, because I understand how easily a story like this could be twisted into a request for sympathy that I don't believe I've earned. I'm not the victim of this story in any simple sense, whatever losses I've genuinely suffered along the way. I'm reporting, as plainly and honestly as I know how, that the bill for what I did to Susan eventually arrived, addressed to me, and that when I finally sat down and actually read the handwriting on it, carefully, without flinching away from it the way I've flinched away from so many uncomfortable truths across my life, I recognized it immediately. It was mine. Every phrase, every carefully managed exit, every minimized guilt, all of it, written in my own hand and simply mailed back to me 2 years later, in a language I understood perfectly, because I was the one who'd taught it to the person who eventually used it against me. I don't know that I've fully forgiven myself for any of it. Susan, Danielle, Marcus, even, in some strange way, Regine and Paolo, who owe me nothing at all beyond the honesty of simply being who they turned out to be. I still catch myself, occasionally, drafting a version of this whole story in my head that positions me more sympathetically, softening a detail here, reframing a decision there, the old professional instinct never fully switched off even now, and I've learned, slowly, to notice when I'm doing it and to stop, to sit instead with the plainer, less flattering version, because I think that plainer version is the only one actually worth telling, the only one that gives whoever's listening something genuinely useful rather than another carefully managed campaign dressed up as a confession. What I've learned, slowly, painfully, is that a story you build carefully enough to survive telling yourself will eventually find its way to someone else's mouth, and you won't get to choose the ending anymore once it does. I didn't choose this one. I only got to recognize it, standing in a doorway in Manila, 62 years old, hearing my own voice come back to me in a stranger's words, and understanding, finally, exactly what I'd spent 2 years refusing to see clearly about myself.